Q&A video, scene 1. Hi guys, today, well, the day this video airs, is exactly 10 years after I posted my first YouTube review.
Hello and welcome to this review of my Dell 8011W keyboard.
Yeah, thankfully we've moved up a little bit from that. Anyway, it's been over 4 years since I did a last Q&A video, and I thought this would be a cool opportunity to do another one. PlayStars asks, for the QA video, what do you think of the craze that we now have 8K polling keyboards, for example Wooting, that implement USB at 480 megabits per second to support that nonsense? And as a more general question, do you think keyboard companies are going on the direction with the current trends? Well, I already thought 1K hertz polling was overkill when that came out, especially if you look at the grand scheme of things, how signals actually get processed in a keyboard. Especially on non-contactless keyboards, the difference is really quite minimal, I think. Personally, I'd much rather get a keyboard that would fit me very comfortably and would work reliably and that I know I would be able to rely on, rather than get such a tiny numbers advantage. But then again, it's not exactly like I'm in esports or anything, so what do I know? As far as the bigger picture question goes, I think when controllers that are capable of handling these sorts of speeds become cheap enough to be used in keyboards for this purpose, that's going to become a standard. I feel like with these kind of trends, there's really no going back anymore. Cheech LeBeach asks, custom metal keys have been all the craze the past number of years. What's your thoughts on that? Is there any good reason, other than cost, that keyboards are usually manufactured in plastic cases? Yeah, so I think customs are now in a very different spot than they used to be a few years ago. It used to be so that the only big, heavy metal keyboards you could get were vintage models and customs, but at some point companies figured out they could also mass produce custom-like keyboards at a much better price range than custom manufacturers could deliver. And so I think the market shifted a little bit into that. I'm sure a lot of customs are being still sold, but I think they're more relegated towards the truly extreme and outrageous models now. As for why you would want a plastic case rather than a metal one, I can think of 3 things. First of all, cost, as you mentioned. Second, retro appeal. There are a couple of examples of this. And typing sound, because roomy plastic cases tend to amplify switch sounds. And therefore, if you have very nice sounding switches, they'll sound better in a case like that. For an excellent example of the last 2 points, go watch my 8-bit do review and the associated typing demonstrations. MaxMouse3 asks, what changed in your life by making these videos? Are you going to make a Keep event here in the Netherlands? Well, I'm not going to organize one, but I do attend almost all the Dutch keyboard meetups, at least the ones I can attend if I'm not, on holiday or something. In fact, I plan on coming to the one in January, which happens to be in my hometown of Utrecht, so I can afford to take some extra heavy stuff with me again. Second, as to what changed my life, other than my house absolutely overflowing with keyboards, as you can see, I've gained a much greater appreciation for working with film, especially cinematography, and maybe one day I'll more seriously pursue a career in voice acting, which a lot of people told me to do. I've done a few minor roles, but not really put myself out there, to be honest, though I'd love to do voice acting and narration at some point. Blackjack8957 asks, will you do the reviews of strange trackball or mouse devices? Well, frankly, the truth is, I don't really care about mice. I might do reviews of really funky input devices. For example, one of those wearable keyboards that you have on your fingers. That one I would definitely do. In fact, I think I requested a review unit from the company that makes them, but I got no answer. But that's still a keyboard, even if it's a really weird one. Something like a trackball only or a mouse only, I don't think I would do. Invalid OS asks, you said you were a chemist before and posted the somewhat terrifying video of you quenching sodium hydride. So what field of chemistry do you work in? Do you use a mechanical keyboard in the lab at all, or not due to fear of damaging it? So first of all, I work in a group that mainly does organometallics with a side of electrochemistry, polymer chemistry, and some photochemistry. By the way, we've got a lot more terrifying stuff than sodium hydride. That's almost benign by organometallic standards. Second, I brought one of my old Zenith keyboards to work because I can't stand the crappy standard rubber dome keyboards we get with our computers. And I also brought an old Focus keyboard for use with the spectrometer that I manage because that comes with a laptop with really crappy switches as well. I did write on a sticker on it to warn people to be careful with that though. Marco Fershin 9973 asks, have you ever considered setting up a museum-like structure for your collection where you charge people to let your keyboards be seen and touched? Would make it a lot easier for newcomers to know what they're after. Well, in my experience, there's no better way to kill a collection than that. If you walk into an electronics store where they sell keyboards, you always notice that half the keycaps are missing and a bunch of switches are broken, and obviously I'm not really looking to get that done to my collection. I have given friends a tour of my collection, and when I go to meetups I tend to bring some of the more exotic stuff with me so that people can try it out, but I think that's about the extent of the museuming I want to do. Demon Spud Guy asks, what is your favorite musical act, and did you ever actually get that Bethel, or however it's spelled, keyboard? So my favorite band is probably Green Day, but I listen to an incredibly wide range of music, from classical to doom metal. I even DJ a few sets of my own. If you follow me on Twitter, you might have seen one or two of them come by. That's mainly melodic techno, ethereal techno, and some deep house. I'm extremely passionate about music, to be honest, and that's one of the reasons I keep doing those trailer videos. It's really much more of an excuse to have fun with film and music than to really genuinely drive hype towards a keyboard review. As for the keyboard you mentioned, that's the Berthold, the G800081, which is one of Cherry's very earliest keyboards they ever made. I think it was produced for a printing company or something like that. It's incredibly rare and difficult to get a hold of though, so I've kind of given up hope. But I would love to cover that one day. Serg MHV3B asks, do you think good modern designs like Gateron click leaves, Cal click bars, and various Hall effect linears can genuinely compete with the classics like Alps and Fujitsu leaf springs, or are they just better than MX but not up there with vintage? It would be cool to hear your opinion on feel and sound separately. So it depends on the switch, of course, but in general I think the trend is pretty positive. In terms of click bar switches, I think there might be, well, at least they feel to me, like a little bit of a evolutionary transition state. If very much if good leaf spring switches ever become mainstream again, I think they might become somewhat obsolescent. But in terms of key feel, they're an improvement over Cherry MX switches, definitely, in my opinion, because they have a snappier key feel, and they also have a clearer sound, because they don't have a rattling click jacket like MX switches do. ZealPC clicky switches aren't exactly the same as Alps, mainly because he made them way too tactile, but they do have the nice same snappy tactility that you get from good leaf spring switches, and the sound is very satisfying as well, especially if you have a big old roomy plastic case. So I think they're pretty nice if he fine-tuned the tactility a little bit to, bring it down to, let's say, human levels. I very much look forward to covering that again. Finally, I'm not really aware of any copycats of Fujitsu leaf spring switches, but if you mean just Hall effects to supplant them, I think modern Hall effect linears are better than they've ever been. I'd much rather use an Apex Pro or a Wooting 2 or something like that than even a really good old micro switch or Honeywell board. They're that good, which is why I keep raving on about them, especially if they have adjustable actuation, which is such a game changer in my opinion. In terms of sound, it's a little bit more difficult because many of them sound pretty bad, frankly. But that's also partly due to the chassis, so yeah, difficult to say. LKJL asks, knowing what you know now, if you could time travel to any time period and experience any of your favorite vintage keyboards as brand new, which time period would it be? I'd say definitely the late 80s. I grew up on IBM keyboards as a kid, so I know what they felt like back in the day. And in the 90s, keyboards tended to become shittier again already, so but I'd love to try out some factory fresh brand new Alps keyboards and see how they would compare. Or even better, I would love to, talk with some people and find out what actually happened during the manufacturing history of those switches, because the history of that is fairly unclear and we only have bits and pieces left. Shoeless JP asks, what is your favorite keycap color set for standard boards, assuming Space Cadet is not allowed as an option? Well, for me at least, the only non-standard keycap sets I really, really like are Space Cadet and Dasher. Of course, vintage beige and black are also always fine. It's hard to go wrong with them. But in terms of non-standard ones, it's really those two. By the way, I've covered both of the board originators of those keycap sets in previous videos if you're interested. Langley NA asks, who does keyboard configuration and remapping best for you in software and in hardware? Yeah, so I'm really partial to the way Focus did it personally. You just pressed a program key plus the key you want to program, then whatever string or key you wanted to put in, and then press the key again that you wanted to program, and that's it. They only had a very limited amount of characters that you can put on a key, but in terms of user friendliness, I think that was the best way to do it. Of course, that's not going to cut it for particularly complicated keybinds and, the more difficult and specific things you want to program, but I guess that's what you have software for. As for which software I prefer, personally I'm really partial to VIA. I think that was a big game changer for me. The Source of Denial asks, what was the keyboard that made you get into this hobby? It was an Acer 6312 I found in the basement of the chemistry building I worked in at the time. So I was using a rubber dome keyboard at the time, and when I found that Acer keyboard, which is super clicky by the way, I thought, wow, this is something really, really different. What is this? And then I read up on it, saw the whole backstory about mechanical keyboards, and kind of fell into this rabbit hole. Pretty soon after that, I was getting basically every mechanical keyboard the whole university was getting rid of, and I was scouring about 6 or so recycling centers in the neighborhood for second-hand keyboards. So yeah, it went pretty quickly after that. Yo, what's up 9909 asks, how do you properly store keyboards? Some old keyboards get damaged by their cable due to chemical degradation, I think, and I'm interested how you store them in the cardboard boxes. Or what do you do if your keyboard didn't come in the original box? Great question. So I keep them in simple cardboard boxes, as you can see here. If I don't have the original one, I use another transplant keyboard box. I was lucky enough to find a whole pallet of old Dell keyboards at some point, and I took the biggest boxes home in a giant bag, and quite a lot of these boxes are actually relabeled Dell boxes. I also got from, I think, a Desk Authority user a quite big stash of foldable boxes that I keep. For example, my Model M's here, you should be able to see them on the background. They're very nice as well, pretty sturdy, and they can fit 2 Model M's in there at the same time. As for the cable chemical degradation thing, I think you mean when the plasticizers leach out of the cables, and if they're pressed tightly into another plastic part, they can, plasticize that as well, and that tends to look like a sort of burn mark. If you want to avoid that, just make sure that the cables are either not in direct contact with the keyboard cases or other plastic parts, or at least are not pressed into them. Sherman Zuki asks, what brought you into reviewing keyboards, and what was the first keyboard that you ever touched? Well, the first keyboard I ever touched was an IBM Model F, actually, so I started off at a really high note, thankfully. It was part of a Model F XT portable computer that my dad brought for me when I was 3 or so years old. It was a really good keyboard. I made a video on that system, not the exact computer, but the same model, a few years ago, if you want to check that out. As for what got me into reviewing keyboards myself, it was frankly other reviewers at first. It was mainly Mr. Interface and V Westlife, but Mr. Interface did really short form, not very in-depth videos, and V Westlife is more of a general vintage hardware channel than a true keyboard channel, so I wanted to give it my own spin from the perspective of a true keyboard enthusiast. Bov413 asks, can you wear a hat for the question after this? See. Manitou Black asks, firstly, love your work. Cheers, mate. Secondly, favourite beer from the old country. Well, if you mean my country, it's Hertog Jan, which is a Dutch lager, although my overall favourite beer would probably be Golden Dragon, which is a quite strong Belgian beer. Next, do you know what happened to AcePad Tech, the firm that basically revived Hall effect switches? Have a board of theirs, it's very Gen 1, but part of the charm, but it seems they no longer exist. Kind regards from Australia. Well, g'day, mate. So the first one to introduce new Hall effect switches were AcePad Tech and SteelSeries, who worked somewhat concurrently. I think AcePad Tech just released their product a little bit earlier, but they were developed around the same time. And as far as I can tell, AcePad Tech was a quite small company with really pretty much only that as their product, whereas SteelSeries is a much bigger company with a bigger portfolio, so they could afford to, maybe take a little bit more of a hit on such a new thing. I think I once spoke to one of the salespeople and they mentioned that they don't even make money off of the Apex Pro, they just developed it as a sort of technical exercise or something. Lanes100 asks, do you have any ideas on how to improve the MX style switch design for tactility, or is it hopeless and we should just abandon the current design for an entirely new design? Frankly, the latter. If you stick to what makes an MX switch an MX switch, I don't think you'll ever get truly good tactility out of it. The design just doesn't lend itself towards that. Of course, you can take an MX-shaped housing and replace the innards with things that do actually generate tactility, such as, for example, click bars. That's clicky, but you get my point. Or, a tactile leaf or something like that. But then it's really a completely different switch just in an MX-shaped housing, so that doesn't really count in my opinion. Vian Shift, sorry if I butchered that name, asks, have you tried the Fujitsu LiberTouch? I think I tried it once at a meetup at some point, but I don't recall the details very well, and I need to have it in front of me for an extended period of time to really test it out. I would love to cover it in a future review at some point, though. Jugo Stran asks, do you have plans to review IBM buckling rubber sleeves? The thing is, with almost everything I haven't reviewed yet, the problem is the same. I don't have the keyboard, so I can't review it, and the channel is entirely donation dependent for its content, so unless someone donates one to me, I can't make a video about it. Noodles is Away asks, what is the computer that you use to do all your editing and gaming on? Or rather, what parts does it have? It's just my normal home PC, which has a Ryzen 7 7000X and a GeForce 4070 Ti. Alexandra Costa 2567 asks, what beverage goes well with a corn? Not a clue, mate. I have no idea what a corn is, but what could possibly go badly with a right Russian? Akarin asks, what are some of the countries you've traveled to and any favourites? So far I've been to, apart from the Netherlands obviously, Belgium, Luxembourg, the United Kingdom, Ireland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, Latvia, France, Spain, Monaco, Germany, Poland, the Czech Republic, Austria, Switzerland, Italy, Vatican City, Croatia, Romania, Greece, Malta, Turkey, Egypt, South Africa, Swaziland, Canada, United States, Mexico, Cuba, Belize, Peru, Curacao, Bonaire, Russia, China, Nepal, Vietnam, Cambodia, Singapore, Indonesia, and Australia. And I think that's all of them. It's honestly impossible to really pick a favorite from among all those countries because, I've seen so many beautiful things by now, but I think me and my friends agreed that the trip that was the most fun as an experience, so to speak, was Peru. That was really, really a very cool trip. Next year I'm going to Japan and Portugal, by the way. Linus Bergelund asks, in your position, do you see any of these amazing contactless keyboards but with sound dampening popping up? I can't for the world understand why there are no contactless rubber domes. I believe people who want tactility really just long for snappy rubber domes with a non-mushy bottom-out feel. It sounds like Topri is kind of the thing that you're describing, which is also a contactless switch design, by the way. But someone recently brought to my attention what looks like very much a Hall effect version of rubber domes. It's basically Topra with a magnet in it instead of a capacitive coil spring, and I'm very eager to check that out as well. 25, take one. Motherfuck it. Ziltoid1991 asks, what do you think about people that started to refer to rubber dome switches as membrane regardless of actual use of membranes? Honestly, mate, with all the shit that's going on in the world, I think that's the least of my problems right now. Zakutina Kazumiya 1516, sorry about that, asks, will there be a review on the new Beamspring keyboard from Model F keyboards coming in the near future? Well, yes, when it's out. And with the sudden rise of Hall effect keyboards with analog sensing, will we be seeing more and more affordable HE keyboards with this feature in mind? We already are. In fact, HE boards are now starting to become so common that they're kind of becoming a bit of a banality. You know, I no longer just automatically say yes to every Hall effect keyboard I got offered because, well, frankly, it's not quite the novelty that it used to be anymore. Even though I still tend to really like them, you know, I need to consider a little bit more strongly nowadays. And a follow-up, since MX linears are now more or less perfected with HE technology and Zeal Clickies potentially bringing the new standard for MX clicky switches, is there really hope that someone out there can actually make a tactile MX switch truly tactile? So, see my answer above, but you need to depart from the MX design in my opinion. You could still make it fit MX keycaps and MX footprint, but you need to change the internals. Personally, I still think leaf springs would be a very good choice for that. Nikki2981 asks, if one of the keyboards in your collection were to suddenly disappear, which one would take the longest to notice and which the quickest? I probably noticed the Acer disappearing the quickest because I tend to use it in a lot of videos for sound tests, and similarly for linear switch smoothness, the SteelSeries Apex Pro and the Wooting 2, and finally probably the 8-bit Do keyboard because I tend to do some sound comparisons with that as well. Anything else? Difficult to say really. The slowest ones, all the ones I tend to not really use as reference material for others. Dice Robo asks, any games to recommend that only use the keyboard or more than just WASD for gameplay? Similarly, do you ever emulate retro games and play with just a keyboard? Yeah, so I do play a fair bit of old games occasionally, which is one of the reasons why I keep going on about how Control is jump. Anyone who's ever played Commander Keen knows that, for example. One of the old games on the PC that I can really recommend is One Must Fall 2097, which I think is one of the best PC fighting games ever made, especially the tournament mode. That's really good. One Must Fall was fantastic. I think it's a criminal shame that that hasn't been remastered or remade in some capacity. I have also done a few videos of me actually gaming on the portable PC XT that I mentioned in an earlier question. Those are fairly long-form videos of me playing some classic old DOS games. I might do a few more of those in the future at some point, but I need to have some sort of network adapter or something installed on my computer because I'm hitting the limit of what I can do with simple floppies on that machine. And yes, I also use a whole bunch of emulators as well. Lajola asks, do you think the Cherry MX standard will be replaced anytime soon? Nah, probably not. People are way too attached to their fruitcake coloured keycap sets for that to ever really be a thing. And as far as the pinout goes, especially with the advent of hot swap sockets, I don't think so. I think that's very much become a set-in-stone standard. That said, contactless keyboards tend to have a different pinout, also still hot swappable, and they seem to be doing okay. And do you think there will ever be a one-on-one reproduction of SKCL, SKCM Alps switches? Well, never say never. I mean, I wouldn't have imagined someone would remake buckling spring keyboards either, but then again, here we are. But on the other hand, I think with Alps it's much more difficult because, first of all, Alps switches consist of way more parts than IBM buckling springs. And second, I think the market for Alps aficionados is much smaller than that for IBM aficionados. I think the closest we are going to get to that is those Zeal PC clicky switches, because that way at least people can still use their strawberry ice cream coloured keycaps. It would be really cool to see some authentic remakes of Alps switches though. Lorenzo Terrassi 4491 asks, do you have any insight on why we haven't seen a buckling spring switch since the Sega Terra Drive? I think the reason for that is twofold. First of all, in order to produce a new buckling spring switch, you would have to develop a patent which would improve on the original design, which is difficult and expensive to do. And second, by the time these came out, they had already started to work out kind of which switch types worked and which didn't. You know, at some point there was a huge deal of experimentation on the keyboard market because frankly they had no idea what switch type was going to work. But by the time of the Sega Terra Drive, it was fairly well known, I think, what switches worked and which didn't. Now, the reason Alps developed their own buckling spring switch was basically because they were making IBM's keyboards for the Asian market, and as such they developed a few switches that they wanted to use to mimic the feel of IBM keyboards. But apart from them, there really wasn't any need for anyone else to do something like that, I think. Tunnel Zero asks, maybe not the most creative, but if you were to redo your top 5 or top 10 videos, where would Tai-How Clicker, Apple Hairpin, and maybe some other shit biscuits from after those videos that I don't recall be? So the top worst switches video would probably look quite different. I'm not exactly sure what would go where or something like that, but it would be different, yeah. Also, what is your favorite type of switch architecture? So that really depends on linear, tactile or clicky in my opinion. So for linear, I think it's got to be something Hall effect, right? For tactile, definitely Alps. I think nothing can really match that leaf spring type of tactility. And for clicky, I'd say it's either Alps for sound or buckling or beam springs for typing feel. That said, with the advent of hot swappability and more exotic internals, shall we say, the MX architecture has also made huge progress, I think. Last Scattering Service 9950 asks, have you considered wiring up a keyboard with an aftermarket PCB encoder? You can get metal plates with the switch holes already cut out and make a custom keyboard. Well, frankly, I'm not very good with coding. I'm not an IT guy or anything. I'm a chemist by trade. So that sort of programming is a little bit beyond my level. I have had some people help me by making converters for vintage keyboards that otherwise can't talk with modern keyboards. And I've done one custom keyboard-ish called Project A, which was a drop-in replacement keyboard module for an Apple IIc that I had a custom wooden housing made for by a carpentry company. And you could also buy one of those aftermarket converter board things that you could just plug USB into. But that's kind of rare that you can do that off of the market, and it was quite expensive. So I think that's about the furthest I'll ever go in terms of custom keyboards. Jackson Hall 3151 asks, what's the smoothest linear switch you've ever felt? Yeah, so it's going to be one of those modern contactless switches. It's a little bit difficult to say exactly which one, because at some point the friction becomes so little that it's very difficult to feel the difference between the different types. You know, they're all just so smooth that it's hard to really feel a difference. In fact, if I were to redo my top 5 linear switches video, it would just be a very big single shared win for all these. Dawn of Clarity asks, ever tried a Datamancer keyboard? Mine has been going strong for many years. No, though they do look gorgeous. I'd love to try one out at some point. Robert Borner asks, can you explain the differences between different magnetic switches, specifically in regard to why not all magnetic switches are compatible with all magnetic keyboards? There doesn't seem to be a good resource on this topic. So there are quite a lot of different switches that use magnetism as a principal operating component. For example, you've got magnetic reed switches, which use metal contacts, but then with the proximity of a magnet near it to magnetize the contacts, which then close. But that's still, a contact-based switch. And then there's also, for example, inductive switches, which work in a completely different way, and magnetic valve switches, which work in yet again a different way, etc., etc. So on that basis alone, not all magnetic switches are interchangeable. But I'm going to guess you're specifically talking about Hall effect switches, which, by the way, uses yet another operating principle. That's about charge asymmetry along a circuit, basically. And the reason that they are not all interchangeable is actually kind of banal. It's simply because even if they fit the same footprint, you might be dealing with different magnet strengths, different magnet distances to the PCB, the sensing assembly, that sort of thing. It's really just a matter of how physically it's fit in the same package, and that can be quite crucial because Hall effect switches are quite sensitive to differences. Technically speaking, though, if the magnet strength and positioning within the switch and all that sort of stuff would be the same, then yeah, technically you could interchange the two. Alexander Acosta 2567 asks, are there any keyboards with symbolic value to you? Yeah, so there's a couple. Like I mentioned earlier, there's the Acer, and there's also the Zenith I use at work, plus a few Focuses and IBMs, and one or two others that I've gotten attached to. Pickle4293 asks, do you plan on using an HDMI to USB video card? That way you can record the video from the camera directly into your PC, and a dummy battery. That way you don't have to swap the batteries every time they die out. Frankly, there's not really that much of a point. I don't very often encounter the problems you describe. It's quite rare, actually, and I think I'd rather just save up for a better camera or something. Himto asks, have you ever broken a keyboard from rage? No, I can get pretty ragey at times, just ask my parents, but I haven't broken anything, no. Kotodos7, I think, asks, what's the loudest keyboard you have used? Honestly, it might be that new Model F from Ellipse. That thing's got a solenoid in it, and it is absolutely deafening. I think I might genuinely require hearing protection when using that. Albatross9933 asks, what keyboard is most active in your rotation / do you find yourself coming back to the most recently? So I use the 8-bit Do keyboard a lot because it's very useful for a lot of testing, plus it's frankly a pleasure to use, even though it doesn't have a numpad. Second, what games are you playing right now? So some long timers include Tarkov, Diablo 2 and Firestorm, which is an in-development title based on the Command & Conquer universe, developed by the same people that also made Renegade X. It's a sort of RTS FPS hybrid game, and as it happens, by the way, I voice one of the characters in that game, which is a lot of fun to do. Me and Kyle are playing Icarus together at the moment, and there's loads other games, frankly, but that changes pretty much every week. Golden Raki asks, what's the best 40% keyboard now? Hyper 7, Acco, Epo Maker, etc. Which would you recommend? I'd love to hear from you. Cheers, mate. I must admit, I'm not entirely sure. I tend to not take on too many 40% keyboards because, frankly, I find them incredibly horrible to use. So I'm not an expert on that subject matter. But just purely based off of looks, I would go for the Hyper 40, which is a 40% version of the Hyper 7. That thing looks incredible. I've been trying to procure one so far without success, but I'd love to cover that at some point. Kevin Kuhn asks, may I ask if it's possible for some ASMR videos using the best vintage keyboards with the best switches? I used to do a series called the TDXL series, which is short for Typing Demonstration Extra Large, or Extra Long, I guess, which is basically what you're describing. It's just a longer typing demo on its own, and that includes a 100-minute video of me typing on more than 100 different keyboards, so that might be what you're looking for. The playlist for that is public, so you should be able to find it on my YouTube page. Powerhouse5938 asks, have you tried a 144Hz high refresh rate monitor yet? I'm using one right now. I've got a curved 4K widescreen monitor. It's a Gigabyte M32U or something like that. It's really nice. I really like it. Uthun asks, would you rather eat a bowl of Blue Alps like cereal or be constantly listening to the sound of capacitive buckling springs for a month? You what, mate? Case 9526 says, insert burp. You're welcome, mate. Logipilot asks, why no Ducky? The Ducky 1.3 has onboard programmability, no software, and a hot plug PCB plus chassis with nice caps. To be honest, I think I asked them for a board years ago, but they didn't respond to me. As for now, I'm not sure what I'd want to cover from the catalogue because I don't think they do that many innovative models. Big Dude 101 Oh Yeah asks, on a scale from Smith Corona to Blue Alps or Model F, where would generic PC rubber dome boards sit? If you were to write a review of one, would it justify a waning, or would it be too boring to even bother with? I really hate the HP scissor switchboard I use at work, but something tells me that it can be worse. Okay, so if one is a 0 and the other is a 10, then I'd say generic rubber dome sit maybe around, let's say, a 3. I've had way better, but I've also seen worse. I think scissor switches are even worse because of the shallower travel. To me, that feels worse, definitely. That's maybe a 2 out of 10. I think the Apple aluminium keyboards I reviewed, they were pretty sweary as well. Apart from some really iconic models like that HP thing with the semi-silver top and whatnot, I tend to not bother with rubber dome keyboards unless they're really iconic. Then maybe I do one, but I don't intend on that becoming a standard thing because frankly they're just too boring for me to cover. Akarin asks, keyboards are your biggest hobby, what's your second biggest one? Oh man, I have so many hobbies, I'm not even sure keyboards are my biggest one, to be honest. I also really like traveling. I'm completely obsessed with music, which is one of the reasons why I make DJ sets and music videos. And I collect other things besides keyboards as well, although they are the biggest collection I have. But for example, one other one is airsoft replicas, which you might be able to see in the background here as well a little bit. Basically, I'm just utterly fascinated by the world as a whole and feverishly working on 10 or so things at the same time. I never sit still. SH1969 asks, what's the furthest you've ever thrown a keyboard and did you retrieve it? Man, I'm not a violent person at all. I've never thrown a keyboard. Would you do more chemistry content if people asked for it? Not if people asked for it, but never say never. In fact, one of our former students is now doing precisely that, and one of my former colleagues used to do that as well. So who knows? But I would want to do it in an official capacity with the full resources of the lab at my disposal. Disjunable asks, do you currently have some kind of favorite keyboard or one you use a lot more than the others? Well, the ones I use at home have to constantly rotate because I have to test them for the reviews I make for you guys, but the keyboard I use at work stays put, which is my Zenith ZKB2, which, as it happens, is also a board I really like. It's very much one of those go-to keyboards for me that just does everything properly without complaining. Ethics asks, I'm interested in your video making process. Obviously you use a voiceover, so do you just sit in complete silence doing hand movements while you film the actual review? or do you listen to your voiceover while filming and adjust your demonstrating process accordingly? Neither, actually. During Corona time, as it happens, I made a fairly long video where I show in detail how I produce my keyboard reviews. You might find that interesting, go check it out. It's in my behind the scenes playlist, which also contains things like previous Q&A videos. Gabriel Milcham asks, you're in hell, forced to use the worst keyboard to type and record every damned soul in the pit. Which one is it? Also, the opposite for Heaven's residents, the best. So, I think the worst keyboard I have is probably the laser projection keyboard. That thing is just so overall terrible and unsalvageably useless. First of all, it makes this horrendous beeping noise that you can't switch off. Second, you have to type on the table itself, so it really starts to hurt your fingertips after a while. And third, it just records absolute rubbish. What it records has nothing to do with what you're actually typing. So I think that would be the hellish one. And as for the Heaven keyboard, it would probably be either the Acer or one of my Beamers. Langley NA asks, prior to, say, 2022, with the increase in newly manufactured product reviews, estimate how much of your collection was acquired by recycling center, trash, trading, and receiving gifts. So there were basically two main switches. The first one was when I moved from the UK to the Netherlands in 2017, which lost me access to the recycling centers I'd been using. That was a huge change. And the second one was in 2022 when I stopped buying keyboards altogether. Thankfully, by that time, I'd built up a large enough base that I could get around with using only donations. But before 2021, I'd say the vast majority of my collection was from recycling centers and that sort of stuff. A very few keyboards in my collection I've obtained through trading, but some of the ones that I have had were quite important, including the Acer and the Zenith, actually. Mesa 1277 asks, does anybody at work know that you make keyboard videos? And what about the students? I think almost everyone at work knows, with the exception of some of the new students we just got in, but in general, pretty much everybody knows. In fact, a few people at the university collect keyboards for me even. Sam Rosenthal 2111 asks, I believe you said in a previous Q&A that you live in Utrecht, so have you ever visited the Speelklok Museum? In a similar realm, do you play any musical instruments? Of course I visited it, I think multiple times even as a kid growing up. Although I don't think it's the best museum, frankly. As for musical instruments, I used to play the piano when I was a kid, though that's a long time ago. I did play a little bit of piano for a keyboard review, in which, well, that was an April Fool's video where I reviewed a musical keyboard as if it were an actual keyboard. I did a little bit of playing in there. Yitchem, I think, asks, has the Model F Lab outcompeted Unicomp? I'm not sure because I don't have sales figure from Unicomp, but from what I understand, Joe raised about 3.5 million or something with his keyboard so far, which is quite a lot, but Unicomp offers a quite different product, frankly. First of all, they're on a very different price class. Unicomps are way cheaper, and it's just not really the same product, so I'm not sure they directly compete in a lot of ways. That said, if I would be able to buy either a Model M or a Model F, I'd pick an F every day myself. Neapolitans asks, are there any other vintage keyboards that you'd love to review, or have you pretty much gotten a hold of everything you wanted to make a video on? Also, who are your favorite content creators on this platform? Love your videos, by the way. Thanks, May. Well, to be honest, there are still so many keyboards I'd love to cover, but the problem is, of course, I've covered so many already that the ones I still want to cover are super hard to get hold of. So, for example, the aforementioned Berthold keyboard, the Alps Yamato, the Behemoth, Glasses big keyboard, one of those Google Infinity rings, basically anything that's super giant or super weird, I'd love to have a go at. As for which are my favorite YouTube content creators, I must admit I very rarely watch other keyboard reviewers, as their interests only very rarely overlap with mine. So I think most YouTube creators I follow are music related or gaming related, or a few other of my interests. There are quite a lot though. Diabolesco asks, you have to make your selection my 3 favorites of all time, all things considered, and the one that you would take to a desert island. Again, the Acer, Zenith and Beamship spring to mind, and if I had to pick just one to use, I'd probably go for the Acer, as it's even better to use than the Zenith and more go-to than the Beamship. Marco Fershin 9973 asks, which Cherry G80 keyboard is your favorite, and which Cherry keyboard in general is your favorite? The answer to both is the same. It's the G800081, which is the Bertold keyboard I talked about earlier. New MH990 asks, what's your favorite SAP transaction and why is it your favorite? It's Mike Echo 21 November because it's relatively non-fucked up and it's also the one I use the most. Ziv Zulander asks, if a keyboard maker wanted to partner with you to design a Girosron 22 co-branded keyboard, what switches and feature would be an absolute must to have your branding and explicit or implicit endorsement behind it? Would you have any aesthetic preferences for it? I don't think I have any specific requests, as long as it's something really interesting, something genuinely different from what you can buy in just a generic electronics store, and obviously really good. And as for aesthetics, I'd prefer a vintage or retro look, of course. International A5 asks, having tested tons of keyboards over the years, surely there are some very uncommon, obscure keys you have found in some older keyboards. Out of all the really uncommon keys you have found, which one do you think is the most useful? You wish it exists on mainstream modern keyboards. So there's a couple I can think of. First of all, the numpad comma, which is very useful, especially if you have to work with both decimal points and commas, all the time basically, as well as the compose key, which is a really interesting key that allows you to press quite straightforward combinations of keys to make composed characters. For example, here's a list from Wikipedia that shows you a couple of common shortcuts. I think that would be really cool. And you could swap it for the insert key or something, because that key is fucking useless anyway. In fact, if anything, I think it's a negative. I'd rather it not be on a keyboard. Wow L9 asks, in addition to Ellipse's Round 2 F104, do you plan on looking at the larger offerings, like the F122 or B122 once those start being built? They come with a beefier onboard controller. Also, how are you doing in general? Doing great, thanks. We chose to go with the F104 because Joe thought that would be the most appealing model for the market, and for me I wanted to use it because I think it fit the narrative that I wanted to tell in that review the best. So the F104 seemed the most logical one to go to. As for which ones I can cover, I'm completely on Joe for that sort of thing. Like I said, the channel runs entirely on donations, so I take what I can get, I guess. That said, I would love to cover one of the bigger models at some point, one of the Battleship models, because I'm a full-size plus guy myself. Silver Shadow asks, what switches do you use as your baseline for good switches? Do you have a specific switch that you use to compare each switch to? Frankly, I tend to compare things, at least internally, with the best there is in that type. So, at least according to my own opinion. So for linear, that would be Hall Effect. For tactile, that would be Alps. And for clicky, it would be buckling or beam springs. I'd say the average, or at least median keyboard is Cherry MX. And I do use that as a standard often, especially in videos. Free Banshee 4186 asks, I really like the SteelSeries 6G V2 keyboard, but it has soldered switches. I've already gone twice through the trouble of desoldering and resoldering new switches, but I'm weary of it. Have you already tried soldered hot swap sockets? Are they any good? Oh man, I think I must have been one of the first people to push hot swap sockets. I think they're just excellent. They're such a game changer. I'm really happy that they've become, well, pretty much an industry standard, apart from the crappier premium keyboards, of course. But other than that, a lot of people have gone hot swap, and it's really, really good in my opinion. It makes so much difference. I've not tried hand soldered hot swap sockets, and I've never done it myself either. But, you know, pre-soldered ones. Matt Crowley 8993 asks, will you ever deal with a keyboard worse than Smith Corona leaf spring over membrane? To be honest, I think maybe even at the time I'd had worse. The reason, or one of the reasons I put that switch at the top of the list was because the keyboard I had of that was just so immaculately clean, yet still terrible. Whereas other keyboards I had were maybe worse, but they were also in worse condition. So I found it difficult to strike a balance there. I might do it differently now. I'm really not sure. Frankly, it's been so long since I used all that shit. As for new ones I might get that are worse than Smith Corona, hit me up. I'm ready to try. Tom Pramanak Count 8892, sorry if I butchered that, mate, asks, what is your idea to make the keyboard scenes more interesting, to say the least? I've seen here, at least in Southeast Asia, they started to explore more on Hall effect switches, which is a bit late, I must say, where you already give your take on it way back when. So I'm just curious, what's your next interest that maybe can possibly inspire them too in the future? That's a great question. So lately I've been covering some keyboards with really wacky features, like, you know, onboard calculators and screens and all that sort of stuff. And I think that will probably always remain interesting. So that's definitely something to look out for, I think. And second, in terms of switch designs, I've got really high hopes for more leaf spring inspired switches. So you know, something similar to Zeal PC switches, but for example maybe a tactile version of it, or, you know, a different clicky one. The reason I'm so obsessed with those leaf spring switches is that, in my experience, leaf springs are just singularly well suited to generating tactility, and that's possibly the part of keyboard switches that, especially the modern market, is by far the most lacking in. Dante Haroon asks, what are your thoughts on the current state of clicky MX type switches? Did Melodic surpass clickies for you, and what about Box Navy or Jade? Do you think there's still room for improvement, or is this as good as it gets for small housings? So the MX switch is now starting to get some decent competition finally, which is good. I really like that. Not because I hate MX switches, but because I like people to have a wider range of truly different options at their disposal. I think that's great. As for melodics, they're pretty good, honestly. Compared to clickies, I think clickies have more potential, but they are, at least the current version of it, is so ridiculously overtuned for tactility that it's a bit much in my opinion. Much the same goes for Jades, I think, as well. Basically, slightly intense version of those switches would be ideal, but it is a good example of what great results you can book once you dare venture outside the realm of MX switches. Abunk8691 asks, I know you don't like, or even outright despise, scissor switch keyboards like those found on laptops, but which laptop has the least terrible you have tried? I see people online swearing by the ThinkPad keyboards when it comes to laptop keyboards, some of the older IBM era ones and some of the newer chiclet ones way after Lenovo acquired the brand. Yeah, I've got a ThinkPad, though I don't think I've reviewed it yet. It's pretty decent as far as laptops go. Other than that, for me it would probably be the Bondwell keyboard, because that one actually uses genuine Cherry MX switches. It's Cherry MX Navy to be specific. And if you count any sort of portable keyboard, I'd put in the Model F of my IBM 5155 keyboard, although that one is considerably bigger and heavier than a full-size modern desktop. Vegas59 asked, what was your first ever mechanical keyboard and how did you like it at the time? Yeah, so speaking of, the IBM 5155 came with a Model F keyboard, and I know I really liked it at the time, but I had no frame of reference, of course. But I do distinctly remember the keyboard that I got after on the computer that replaced that IBM, and I think that might have been a Model M even, and I distinctly remember thinking at the time that it was not as good as the Model F I had before. Immortal Potato 5376 asks, what's your favorite song of all time? That would be Jesus of Suburbia by Green Day. Amphetamine Reptile asks, over the past 10 years, have you ever tried a switch that a majority of people seem to hate, but you yourself enjoyed or at least shared a different opinion? Great question. There are a lot of switches that other people like but I don't like, but the opposite is not often true. Maybe an example I can think of is SMK second generation switches, specifically the clicky ones. I think they are really underrated, especially the MX stem ones, which allow you to use modern MX keycaps with them. It feels like there's almost no excuse not to use them, really, and they are so good. Even I underestimate them every time I use them. Ring System Music asks, do you miss doing reviews of historical keyboards? To be honest, yes, I do. It's simply very rare for me to get donations of vintage keyboards anymore. I still do have a few that I have to review, but new ones, it's very difficult to get them, and also especially ones that are different enough from ones I've already reviewed, which is a considerable number by now. I'm well over 500 keyboard reviews in, so it's difficult to find more good material and make it come to me, basically. That said, it's not a total loss because there have been so many developments in modern keyboards and so many interesting additions, new switch designs and whatnot, that I do at least get to cover something interesting, I think. I really like following all these things, all these new things that are happening now in the keyboard world. Plus, it's a lot more relevant to the viewer as well, because these are keyboards that you can actually, buy rather than having to dumpster dive for 2 years and whatnot to find some obscure keyboard that's usually in pretty shitty condition. That's nice. And of course, finally, it avoids the gyros effect, as someone called it, which is basically where I review some old keyboard and then the price would absolutely skyrocket afterwards and nobody would be able to buy it anymore. International A5 asks, have you ever gotten compliments from people around you in real life for your voice? Yes, many actually. It's one of the reasons I'd like to do voice acting and narration. OxyOxy3213 asks, I have a question, where is your English accent from? From all over the place. I'm not an English native, but I did pick up bits and bobs from people around me over the years, ranging from London to York, so that's why my accent might be a little bit difficult to place. I sound a lot more British when I've had something to drink as well. Lucid Moses asks, what's your favorite teaser/trailer that you've done? Oh man, that's like asking a parent to pick between their children. That's a really hard choice. I think if I had to make a choice, it would probably be the neon themed one I made for the Void keyboard. I think that was the 2022 end of year video. That was a blast to make, also took the longest to make of any trailer, at least to date. I know a lot of people, well, the vast majority of people are here for my keyboard content, but for me personally, the trailer videos are the most fun to make. And they're also the only videos of myself that I like to watch back. Watching me, well, listening to me prattle on about keyboards is frankly not very entertaining to me. I'm preparing another 2 trailer videos for the new year, by the way. One is a sort of party-themed one, and the other one is apocalyptically depressing. Creeper Brian 303 asks, what's a keyboard that's so bad it's good for you? Honestly, most of the ones that are really incredibly terrible are at least fun to talk about for me. Generally, they are some of the best anecdotes to have, and they also get the best viewing figures. Whether that's because people just really like to see me swear or anything else, I'm not entirely sure, but they have their own merits, I'd say. For me, the worst keyboard is a boring keyboard, something that gives me nothing to talk about. That is just really difficult to work with. Surian Isaac asks, if you had to run a nuclear power plant or something that needed a keyboard that withstood everything you threw at it, imagine an apocalypse situation and chemical spills, which one would it be and why? Yeah, for something like that, you would want a keyboard that you could very easily clean, I think. And for that, two things spring to mind. First of all, the Fold 2000, which is a sort of rollable silicone keyboard, and something with blister keys like the My First keyboard, which was peanut butter proof according to its own packaging. Those would be easiest to clean. An alternative would be to just buy loads and loads of really cheap keyboards and replace them constantly. All three of those options would give you terrible typing feel though. Tycho Huiberts asks, do you think that the standard NPC keyboard has improved over time? How does an Office keyboard from the 90s compare to the Office keyboards of today? NPC keyboard, I love that term. That's great. What I've noticed is that a few years ago, a lot of standard Office keyboards tended to become low profile rather than full profile. So they've become worse somehow, which is almost unimaginable. But then again, this is kind of a stable trend for keyboards over time in general. Guy, or Guy, asks, could you do more definitions videos like the mechanical one? For example, what does scratchy actually refer to? Is it like sandpaper on the sliders, vibrations like a washboard, etc.? I've been thinking low-key of doing some sort of general definitions or terms video, at least the way I use terms. But I've been a little bit reticent to do so. I used to have a series called Quick Keyboard Tips. QKT videos that dealt with very common keyboard topics on a little bit more of a starter level, so to say. And I made a few episodes of that, but I stopped doing them at some point because basically nobody watched them. As for what scratchy means, that basically means it feels a bit like sandpaper. It's the opposite of smooth, basically. As if there is sand in the switches or something. It's universally applied as a negative. Flick asks, since you started your channel, what would you say are the best and worst developments you've seen in the keyboard community and market? Well, obviously this is going to be a very subjective answer, but to me, the best thing is the greater variety of switches on offer. So not just MX, but also designs like ZLPC clickies, Hall effects, even a few original designs like click bars, which have no vintage equal. A few revived designs like the Model F keyboards and beam springs. Those are all really good. I'm very happy that that's happened. And by the way, honorable mention to hot swap sockets as well. They very much are a game changer. As for the worst development, I'd say it's a greater focus on space-saving keyboards, which I get it, other people like them, but to me it just feels like a dilution of usable keyboards on offer on the market. Rob Ostry asks, what are your favorite pros for vintage and modern keyboard / switch designs? So for the boards themselves, I'd say the biggest pros for vintage are that they tend to be, in my experience at least, better sounding, better serviceable, and better built. Whereas the advantage of modern keyboards is that you don't have to fuck around with a million converters or anything. It's pretty much all just USB, plug in and play, and that is really, really nice. As for the switches themselves, I'd say the advantage of all the switches is that you just have such a vast catalogue of completely different switches that you can try. There are so many different ones out there with such radically different key fields, and it's really cool. It gives you much greater opportunity to explore what you really like in a key switch. But on the other hand, the usefulness of modern switches is that you can just buy them and use them, which neither of those are pretty much are really a given for vintage switches. Cat asks, Red Alert or Tiberian Sun? Ooh, that's a hard one. I think in terms of gameplay, it would be Red Alert, because in Tiberian Sun they tried out a bunch of different things and they didn't really all work out. But Tiberian Sun does have a better story, a better setting. It has better music, I think, with the obvious exception of Hellmarch, of course. And it has the better atmosphere. In fact, I'd say that Tiberian Sun has the best atmosphere of any Command & Conquer game to date. But, some of the unit designs are just a little bit ugly looking. Same thing goes for the buildings. It's a little bit of a mishmash. Sai asks, what's your favorite joke on Imperial units? I don't know, man. That's basically asking me to rate my own jokes, which I'm not very good at. I'd say one of the more memorable ones was where I converted everything into 6.5 inches, and a few people even got the deeper meaning of that one. But I've made so many at this point that I don't even know anymore, mate. Mario Horta asks, with the release of a lot of new switches, even if most are still my types, does your top 5 switches remain the same, or has any new switch been able to conquer a spot? That's a common but very good question. So the linear one, like I said, would be entirely remade with a 5-way tie or more way tie with a bunch of contactless switches, because they're way better than anything else that's on that list, I think. The clicky one would be completely the same because there hasn't been a new switch out that's better than Monterey's, and the tactile one would be completely the same as well because there basically hasn't been any innovation in terms of tactile switches for the last 25 or so years. Editing Tom here. I think in hindsight the Void switch would actually make the top tactile video. I'm not entirely sure where. It would be below Alps, but it might be above some of the others. Not Prepared Gamer asks, what is the best way to handle keyboards and their storage? Some of mine have started to have oxidation on it, and some of the steel ones have straight up rusted bad. I've considered just wrapping it in those plastic wrap, but then I can't get to it easily. Well, if they're rusting, your environment is too humid. Get a dehumidifier or something like that. If at all possible, remove the rust, because the formation of rust makes it possible for more rust to form. And as for the plastic wrap, I'm not sure that would help, because unless it's airtight, then you can plastic wrap it all you want. It's not going to help you at all. Paltalich asks, your most and least favorite Diablo 2 classes or builds. Least favorites, Barbarian and all its build, because they're boring as fuck. My most favorite class is probably the Necromancer, followed very closely by the Sorceress. I think my 2 favorite builds are probably just a good old Summon Necro and Ice Sorceress or something like that. Although I do really enjoy some of the quirkier builds as well, like an Iron Maiden, a Necro, or a Tesla Din. I actually don't really like Hammerdins at all. I mean, I know they're super powerful and everything, but they just control like ass, and it just feels a little bit boring. AI native Bluetooth hater asks, how many Freedom Units jokes do you still have left? As many as you can handle, and then some. Alpha Zakatan asks, do you think that Topra is going to phase out with their snail's pace of development? On a tangent, I think that pre-builds nowadays are so good that DIY builds are getting phased out, if anything. Thoughts? Yeah, so on the latter point first, ever since some big companies decided they could do custom keyboards as well and a lot cheaper, I think a lot of the more, let's say, accessible type custom builds have been pretty much entirely taken over by them. But really quirky builds are almost certainly still going to be, custom and DIY only. And I don't see that changing anytime soon, to be honest. As for Topra, the reason they haven't innovated is because they haven't needed to innovate. I think as long as they are successful at still selling their highly overpriced rubber domes, then people will still buy it and they don't need to change anything. Change costs time and a lot of money, and if they can sell enough keyboards, then why on earth would they change? Huggenknubbel asks, how much are you in love with Wooting? Honestly, I like their products, but I think people see a little bit more than there really is, possibly because we're both Dutch. Obviously, I really like contactless keyboards, and they're one of the companies that do that, but so do other companies I really like. And they're not among my favorite manufacturers even, I'd say. My favorite keyboard manufacturer is Focus, with IBM and Zenith also scoring really high. One of the modern companies I really, really like is 8-Bit Do, because I basically love all their stuff and it's super cool. And even EPO Maker has really started to impress me of late, because they just make the quirkiest shit ever, and I'm really down for that. Tim Trash Goblin asks, since there's been quite a few cool, unique MX form factor switches released in the last years, like Clickies and Gateron Melodic, what's your favorite MX form factor switch now? Proost. Proost. Yeah, I think it probably is Clickies. They just need to tune down the tactility a little bit. Fluffy Brassico asks, do you consider getting into mouse switches as well? So yeah, like I said, mice don't really interest me all that much. You're still planning to make a video for that Class 80 Round 2 with Topras. Unfortunately, that project hit a snag, so probably not, or at least way down in the future. And what is your dream switch that doesn't exist yet? Mine is probably Hall Effect version of Zeal PC's Clickies switch. That's an interesting idea, but I don't think Hall Effect would add all that much to it personally, because if you add a click leaf to a switch, then it's no longer a contactless switch like you normally get with Hall Effects. That said, personally I'd like to see some SKCM switches or something like that. Sam Rose asks, what's one positive and one negative way that YouTube has changed your life? That's an interesting question. So I think one positive thing is that I'm a little bit less nervous to present in public. I used to be quite nervous for that, but still a little bit, but not as much as it used to be. And a negative way, well, after you get a certain amount of views, then it's kind of inevitable that you run into some negative comments every once in a while. It's fair enough, that's normal, of course. You do get dull to it fairly quickly, I think, but still it's never really nice. But overall, I'm very happy that I picked what I'm doing. Matthias asks, are you running out of keyboards in your collection to review? I really miss the vintage boards and I find modern keyboards and MX style switches uninteresting. Now, I still have some, but because I get very few new ones in, I release them rather slowly, to make them last a bit longer. Well guys, 6 hours of filming later, and I guess it's a wrap. I hope you enjoyed this video, and see you in the next episode.